Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Nephilim VA bringing you the 40th chapter of Inheritance, written by A's for Amy 71 on AO3. Well, Endeavor still is not my favourite person ever, but at least there was some humour with the snot treatment Izuku got. How will his internship continue? What kind of hijinks will he get into? Let's find out after the trigger warnings. This fanfiction is for mature audiences with canon-typical violence and a trigger warning for major character death. If that isn't your style, then I recommend Shades of Green, which is written by Maybe It's Friendly on AO3. It can be found on my channel! Canon Divergence is the name of the game and indulges the what-ifs of Midoriya Izuku having a quirk. With that being said, the chapter summary is as followed. Izuku and Shoto have an interesting conversation. Then they face day 2 of the internship. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 40. Lunch was a lively affair when they heard that Izuku had gotten the snot treatment and everyone had a good laugh over their revulsion. They regaled Izuku and Shoto with accounts of times when Doc had tried making himself sneeze on burns to heal them, then realizing that there wasn't enough mucus to do the job, and having to go the other route. Izuku didn't eat much after hearing about it, but was good-natured about it. Shoto didn't eat much either, and Izuku wondered if it was because he was in too much pain. After lunch, they were directed to meet Endeavor at the front entrance, and patrol began. It was different than Izuku had expected, but he still paid close attention, making mental notes of everything he experienced. Unlike when All Might or any of the other heroes Izuku had observed outside of fighting villains, no one really approached Endeavor. There were excited whispers and pointing, and even people shouting greetings to him from doorways of businesses. But he didn't really interact, beyond raising a hand in acknowledgement every once in a while. Shoto and Izuku trailed slightly behind the flame hero, but didn't chat with each other, or speak at all really. It was kind of boring. There weren't many criminals or villains that would dare commit a crime with Endeavor patrolling the street. Apparently, there were not many law-abiding citizens who weren't cowed by him either. Izuku found this to be disappointing, but understandable. At the end of the hours-long patrol, the biggest excitement that they'd had was when Izuku had levitated up to help a storekeeper hang a banner over their shop window, and Shoto had helped an old lady carry her 2 heavy grocery bags. Endeavor left them after their patrol with a satisfied smirk, telling them that when you cut an imposing figure, the streets were safe, and patrols were practically unnecessary. He told them that they were finished for the day and they should get some dinner and a good night's rest. Typical. Shoto grumbled as Endeavor walked away. Izuku looked at him inquiringly. Did you learn anything from that patrol? Anything at all? Shoto asked. Not much, Izuku confessed, except that Endeavor is intimidating to pretty much everyone. Exactly. Shoto walked away then, heading for the elevators, and Izuku followed. He was tired but not sleepy, and decided that he should change out of his costume and wash up, then get food. Shoto didn't say anything beyond, "See you," before disappearing into his own dorm room. He'd washed and gotten some food inside of him, word had spread about Izuku's multiple quirks, and he'd been surrounded by burning sidekickers who had dozens of questions for him. Feeling better after a meal, Izuku took out the notebook he'd bought especially for this internship and went to sit in the common area outside of the dorm rooms. There was a television that some off-duty heroes were sitting around watching, and another on the adjacent wall where a few were playing video games. The seating areas were grouped so that several people could sit and visit with each other, and a few smaller places where anyone who wanted to be alone or talk with another person in relative privacy could go. It was a nice open space that felt comfortable and homey. Izuku didn't want to seem too antisocial, but at the same time he wanted to observe more than he wanted to talk. He chose a comfy armchair that was situated off to the side next to another, unaccompanied one. If someone wanted to seek him out to chat, it was available, but he busied himself with his notebook to kind of discourage it at the same time. He didn't realize how long he'd been engrossed in making notes about Burnin, Kido, and Momonga until Todoroki flopped into the chair beside him and he looked up to find the room nearly empty. "Couldn't sleep either?" Todoroki asked. Izuku hedged. "I haven't tried yet." Todoroki raised an eyebrow, and Izuku wondered exactly how late it was. "I guess I was so busy with this that I lost track of time," Izuku confessed. "You're having trouble sleeping?" "I'm used to sleeping in a futon," he said simply. "What are you working on?" I have a habit of making notes about all of the heroes I meet. Analyzing quirks is sort of my hobby, Izuku told him, feeling slightly embarrassed. "Can I see?" Todoroki asked, holding out his hand. "It's not very good," Izuku said automatically, feeling protective over the notebook, but not really having an excuse to hide it from anyone. He handed it over and Todoroki took it and thumbed through the pages. "You did all of this just today?" he asked, studying a page about Momonga. The page included a rough sketch, what little he knew about the quirk and its mechanics, and a list of questions he had about it. There was also a small section on possible ways to counter any attacks by the hero. "Yeah," Izuku said, fidgeting to avoid making grabby hands to ask for his book back. "There isn't a page about Endeavor," Todoroki observed, flipping through the blank pages at the back, just to check that he hadn't missed anything. "He has pages in another book," Izuku said, not missing the fact that he hadn't referred to him as his dad or father. "Is there a page on me, or do you only do heroes?" Todoroki asked, closing the notebook and passing it back. Izuku blushed in embarrassment. I have a notebook full of pages about everyone in our class," he admitted, "including you." Todoroki said. Izuku was just glad his classmate wasn't creeped out or offended by the idea. "Which reminds me," Izuku said, "I know you have your ice, and once you use it, it has to melt or be melted to go away. But what about your fire? Can you, suck fire in like a vacuum? Say a car is on fire and there are people inside. Could you make the fire go out or redirect it?" "I don't know," Todoroki admitted, seeming like he was considering the matter. "I've never tried. Is that one of the questions from your pages about me?" Izuku nodded. "I've been making notebooks like this for as long as I can remember. Quirks are so different and fascinating. Of course, even though no one really knows exactly what his quirk is, All Might was my first entry," Izuku said, feeling the sudden need to fill the silence. "Since he's always been my idol." "Mine too," Todoroki said. Izuku looked over to see if Todoroki was teasing him, but his face was as stoic as ever. "Really? Even with your dad being a hero?" "You didn't grow up with him," Todoroki said, looking as if he'd smelled something unpleasant. "He's a great hero, but he's not a particularly good man." Izuku felt awkward hearing such a thing, but he was curious. His own father was a good man, and in many ways, Izuku saw him as a hero too. "Is that why you don't use your fire? Because you don't want to be like him?" "Sort of," Shoto said with a sigh. "Have you ever heard of quirk marriages?" It took a moment for Izuku to switch gears and search his memory banks for the answer. Isn't that when two people with really good quirks get married so they can have kids with even better... Oh. Yes. Oh. Todoroki nodded slightly, sounding bitter. Except my mother wasn't exactly a willing participant. It was an arranged marriage. Her family had status but not wealth. My father had both. He expected her to produce one or more children with both of their quirks, so he could train them up to surpass both him and All Might, to create this great legacy. My earliest memories are of my mother trying to protect me from him and his so-called training. He was obsessed with training me, and ignored the others. I was never allowed to play or spend time with my brothers or sister. I don't have a lot of memories of my mother where she's not crying because of him. He drove her into a corner, and she finally snapped one day and poured boiling water on the half of my face that looked most like him. When she realized what she'd done, she tried to use her quirk to stop the burn, but that only made it scar more. Todoroki pointed to the scar over his left eye. Izuku had always assumed that his scar had been the result of an accident with his quirk. It wasn't that unusual for kids to be injured when they first manifested, though it was rarely so severe. That's really... Izuku had a whole slew of words he could use to describe how he felt about what he'd just heard, but none of them seemed very polite. Disgusting, unreasonable, abusive, appalling. Todoroki suggested, drawing his feet onto the seat cushion and resting his chin on his knees. Any of those would work. I'm the youngest of 4, and the only one who got both quirks equally balanced. He likes to call me his masterpiece. The expression on Izuku's face must have betrayed his horror, because Todoroki nodded as if in agreement. It was hard to imagine growing up in a family where the only reason you were born was because your father wanted to force his child to succeed beyond what he had been able to. But I still don't understand. You're not using your fire just because it's what he wants you to do? Exactly. I refuse to become a pawn, using his power to attain his goals. I'm going to become strong using only my own power, and I'm going to surpass All Might like my father never could. But, Izuku said, his brain whirring at light speed, All Might is, old. At least for an active hero. He's going to retire soon, I'll bet. There won't be anything to surpass except maybe the number of people you save. It's not like you're ever going to face off against him in a one-on-one fight to prove you were better. By the time you ever hit number 1, he'd probably have stepped down already. Todoroki stared at him as if he hadn't really considered that part. It was easy to overlook because All Might was larger than life, and it was almost impossible to imagine a world without him always in the spotlight. Izuku knew that time was coming faster than anyone probably realized, but it was still a logical conclusion even with his insider knowledge. And if you're aiming to surpass the number of people saved, you're cheating yourself and doubling your workload by only using half of your power, Izuku pointed out. Think of how many more people you could save, or villains you could take down. I told you I won't use my father's quirk to, but it's not his, it's yours, Izuku said simply. Does your ice quirk belong to your mother, or do you think of it as yours? You have twice the power he does. He even said so, and in a few years everyone will know it, if you work hard and don't cripple yourself. Shoto looked unhappy to be told that. Look, Izuku persisted, I don't know what kind of people my quirks came from except my mum. For all I know, they could have been villains. All I have control of is how I use them, now that they're mine, and use them to be the best person, the best hero I can be. I can get by fine with my ice, Todoroki said stubbornly. I'm sure you can, Izuku said with a level gaze. But only half as fast, and there are others out there giving 100% of everything we've got trying to be the best hero we can. If you think half-arsing it is going to get you where you want to be, I think you might be in for disappointment. Just like at the sports festival. You're not the only one that wants that number 1 spot. Izuku got to his feet and stretched, feeling the sore muscles from his earlier training. He felt bad throwing the sports festival in his face, but it was still true. He imagined that Endeavor had been deeply unhappy about Shoto's performance too. Maybe that was where all of his aggression with training his son today was coming from. Anyway, that's just what I think. It might be worth looking at it from a different point of view. Good night. Izuku left Todoroki there in the common area and retreated to his room, hoping he hadn't overstepped his boundaries too much. He still had 6 days left with Todoroki and Endeavor, and didn't want to make them hell for himself. Todoroki didn't seem angry, but he didn't look like Izuku's little speech had helped him reach an epiphany either. The next day, Shoto acted as he usually did. They worked out with the burn-in sidekickers in the morning, and Izuku got a lot of attention for the amount of weight he could bench press, even without one for all. The heroes they had been scheduled to train with after the morning workout got called out for work, and Izuku and Todoroki were allowed to stay in the gym and continue their workout. "Can I ask you a question?" Todoroki asked Izuku as they washed up after their workout. "You said last night that you have your mother's quirk." Of all the things that Shoto could have taken away from their talk, it was surprising that it was that small detail that had stuck with him. "Yes, when I was 4, we were in a train wreck together. It was caused by a villain rampaging, and she didn't make it. Right after that, we realized that I had pull, and thought I just manifested a quirk like hers. But then I got other quirks, and it became obvious a bit after that it was literally her quirk." "Oh." Todoroki seemed to need time to process that for whatever reason, and didn't ask about anything else. Later, they trained with 2 different heroes than the day before, and Izuku was intrigued by Vertigo's quirk. She could put people within a 3-meter radius off balance by making them dizzy. This was especially interesting because one of Izuku's quirks was a balance and agility combination. They sort of cancelled each other out. Though Izuku did feel the effects of the dizziness, he retained his ability to stay on his feet, even though his aim was off. Added to this was the fact that she was an excellent fighter and nearly as agile as Izuku. "I'll bet we could put together an amazing acrobatic team if we wanted to," she said with a grin as they almost literally danced around each other as they sparred. In the end, it was Izuku's stomach that lost him the match, nearly vomiting all over his opponent in the process. His equilibrium was tossed around for too long as they learned the ins and outs of each other's style, and his stomach couldn't stand it. He surrendered and lurched to the nearest wall to put his head between his knees. This must be how Uraraka felt when she overused her quirk. Vertigo pulled an airsick bag from a pocket in her costume, which was black and white, and basically one of those spirals that gave an illusion of movement when stationary, and offered it to him. "You gave me a run for my money," she told him with a grin, breathing as heavily as he was. Izuku took the bag, but managed to wrestle his nausea back down, even though his mouth had been watering the way it often did before he was sick. After he recovered, it was time to switch partners. And this time Shoto was sweating. There was steam expelling from his mouth and nose with every breath, and Izuku guessed he was working to regulate his body temperature. Something about his training session must have kept him from strong-arming through with his ice. He glanced at Izuku and looked warily at his green complexion before turning his eyes to Vertigo. "You're with me now," she told him. "Hope you didn't have too big of a breakfast." Izuku handed Shoto the airsick bag as he passed and murmured, "Might want to keep that handy." The man that had accompanied Shoto to the room smiled and gestured for Izuku to follow him, so Izuku took a steadying breath and exited the room he'd been in with Vertigo. "Her quirk is wild, isn't it?" the man asked. It's usually a hurlfest when someone trains with her for as long as you did. Izuku knew from the schedule he'd looked over that this hero's name was Fugu, which made Izuku very curious about his quirk. Did he blow up like a pufferfish? He was about to find out! Introductions were made, and Fugu immediately asked about his quirk, then had a dozen or more questions when he learned about inheritance and the resulting quirks Izuku had. How are you able to handle being around scenes where people are dying without being overwhelmed with new quirks? I'm still working on that one, Izuku admitted. You'll want to make it a priority, Fugu warned. Our job is to save everyone we can, but it's not always the reality. You will see people die sooner or later. In disaster zones, we're usually called out after the main chaos is over, but you can't count on it. Izuku nodded, swallowing hard. He had been getting increasingly worried about this fact, and needed to ask All Might and Sir if there was anything more he could be doing. Alright, enough talk about things you can't do anything about right now. We're here to train, Fugu said. You've got some great quirks, but I don't know how much good they'll do when you're fighting me. Your job is to find a way to capture me without destroying the room. A lot of the fights you'll be in are going to be indoors, in enclosed spaces. You'll need to take into account how sound the building structure is, if there are any other occupants that are innocent or unaware of what's going on, and a dozen other little things. Sometimes a quirk that you really rely on will only end up injuring you, and you'll have to deal with it in the best way you can. Am I allowed to ask you about your quirk before we get started? Izuku asked, glad the nausea had passed and his mind was clear. Nope, the man told him cheerfully. For this session, I'm the villain, and you're trying to subdue me without injuring the hostages. Hostages? Izuku asked, looking around the brightly lit but empty room. Fugu pressed a button on what looked like a car's key fob, and a panel in the wall sprang open to reveal a small storage space. Inside was a pair of chairs with cloth dummies tied to them back to back. One wore a bubblegum pink wig and a flowery dress, and the other wore a business suit and had a goatee painted on its face. Fugu dragged them over to the side of the room, near the windows, and grinned. Meet Meiko and Takashi, he said. They're made of cloth because many of us need to train in being careful not to accidentally burn bystanders or hostages. Izuku nodded, already trying to formulate a plan, even though he didn't know what the man's quirk was. Green sparks began to crackle around him as he charged up one for all. Begin, Fugu said. Izuku was moving before Fugu had even finished speaking, zipping to the hostages and lifting them over his head, chairs and all. He zipped back to the door on the other side of the room as Fugu was still turning to see where he had gone. Quick, aren't you? Fugu commented, beginning to charge towards Izuku and the hostages. Izuku opened the door and shoved the hostages out before closing himself back in the room with Fugu. Oh ho! Fugu said with what sounded like glee. A hero who uses his head. Let's see what you got. With these words, a force field of some sort expanded around Fugu, tinged with a swirling of yellow and red. There were small spikes poking out of it. That did indeed resemble the shape of an angry puffer fish. Izuku was entranced for a split second before Fugu punched one of the spikes from his side of the bubble of whatever it was, and the spike came flying towards him as if it was an arrow shot from a bow. Izuku dodged and reached for his quick snuff pellet, not sure if it would work, but willing to test it out by process of elimination at least. Green sparks crackling around him, he leapt over the force field, landing on the side of the room near the windows. The arrows kept coming, and seemed to replace themselves instantly once launched. They also stuck into whatever surface they hit, leaving a spike sticking out that added a new obstacle to the room with each impact. The room's temperature didn't seem any different from the time he'd stepped into it than after the force field had formed, and that didn't hold out much hope when he flicked the quick snuff at Fugu. Sure enough, the pellet bounced off harmlessly and landed intact on the floor. Izuku used pull to retrieve it and tuck it away again. His supply was running low, and he didn't want to exhaust it on the second day of his internship. "What will you do now, Vanguard? You saved the hostages, but how will you save yourself?" Fugu asked with a manic grin. He continued to punch projectiles as Izuku dodged, and Izuku appreciated the fact that the hero was hamming it up to make the little scenario seem more real. Izuku tried to use the same mindset, and envisioned Fugu as an actual villain who had endangered innocent people. He considered his options. Breaking out the windows in any way was a danger to anyone below, so that should be avoided at all costs. Using his strength quirk on the floor or the walls was out for the same reason. Maybe it was time to take a risk? He allowed his leg to brush one of the arrows that was protruding from the floor, and noted that nothing harmful really happened. He timed his dodges to allow him to position himself directly in front of Fugu. A willing target. The next arrow that came toward him would have hit Izuku dead in the chest if he hadn't dodged. But instead of jumping or tumbling out of the way, he treated the arrow like an attacker and waited for the right moment to lean to the side and reach up to snatch it out of the air. The force behind it was no joke, but Izuku had One for All charged up and the strength and speed helping him to keep his grip. The spike vibrated in his hand and sent a humming all the way up his arm that didn't dissipate once it stopped flying. But there was no pain. That gave him options. Fugu was so surprised by Izuku's catch that he stopped punching out spikes for a moment, but then resumed at an even more furious pace. Izuku tried to catch as many as he could, letting them fall to the floor. Fugu advanced on him, and the force field advanced with its owner, but Izuku stood his ground. If the arrows didn't cause pain unless he got stabbed, with the force field, he let the bubble approach with Fugu inside, and continued to swat and kick the arrows out of the way, using his balance and agility to hop from the tops of the embedded ones when he needed to. His shoes didn't melt or spark or anything when they came in contact with them, and he deemed them safe enough, so he waited until he was close enough to touch the bubble. It had the same strange vibration, only stronger, and sent a zing up Izuku's arm that bordered on pain. Excellent. Izuku drew back his arm and punched the force field with a decent bit of One for All behind it, and found it to have an almost rubbery, elastic surface tension, but it also forced Fugu backwards a few steps. It definitely had some impact absorption qualities. If the punch hadn't sent him flying, it seemed that Fugu was at the center of the bubble, and if the bubble moved, then so did Fugu. Interesting. One of the arrows got past Izuku and left him with a stinging gash across his left cheekbone, and he had to remind himself that he was fighting a villain intent on hurting him. The arrows weren't harmless, and he needed to take them seriously. He took an arrow to his hip, but his suit held up the way it was supposed to, and didn't tear or puncture. He was sure he would have a spectacular bruise later, but there was nothing broken. He needed to find a way to end things before he got too tired. Izuku backed away again and scooped up 2 of the discarded spikes from the floor, then grunted when he was hit in the shoulder. The multiple hits meant he was getting sloppy, tired. Aiming carefully, Izuku threw the spike back at Fugu, not to strike him, but to test his theory. Sure enough, the spike pierced the force field and came out the other side, burying itself in the wall behind. "Nice," Izuku said aloud, his lips stretching into a grin. Fugu had a moment to look wary before he was also being forced to dodge his own spikes. The room was full of obstacles at this point, and as Fugu moved around the room, the spikes implanted in the floor and walls hampered him just as much as his opponent. Soon Izuku had reached a stalemate of sorts, with plenty of ammo bristling out of the walls and the floor like porcupine quills. Finally, Izuku made up his mind to force the issue and took several direct hits to get in close again, using one spike in each hand to come at Fugu from 2 angles. He had backed the man into a corner and was now pressed as far into the force field as he could get, the point of each spike up under his chin. Fugu froze. "Well played," the hero said, leaning back as much as he was able. "I concede." Izuku breathed out a sigh of relief and stepped backward. Fugu let his force field drop, making all of the spikes flicker and disappear along with it. The only sound for a few moments was their heavy breathing, as they settled down. "You took quite a few hits, kid. You've got to be hurting," Fugu finally said. "Well, it doesn't feel good," Izuku agreed, "but it was a fun fight." Fugu laughed. "Would it have been as much fun if you'd lost?" he asked, wiping sweat off his brow. "Maybe not, but I did learn a lot." Izuku was still grinning as he stretched his shoulder and winced. It was painful, but it was manageable. He'd likely taken over-the-counter pain reliever before patrol, though. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. If we didn't already know this, Izuku is a badass. It's nice to see Todoroki opening up, even if he doesn't quite grasp the advice he has been given in return. I hope you've all had an amazing week, and the good times keep coming. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, A is for Amy71 on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah.